to kind of get back to some of the results, but to tie in this kind of the misinformation, right, is a lot of people believe that it's not CWD that's actually killing these deer and it's something else. And so we made a conscious effort there for our cause-specific mortalities to collect every tissue that we had possible to us, send it to Squidus, and have them look, okay, did it have HD? Was it any viruses or bacteria or septic in any other form? And we compared, a gambit of common diseases in deer for every single individual that we got, and we had the available tissue so that we could identify and say, with our sample there, 33% of all CWD positive deer that died solely to CWD. Right? We look at that. We wanted to be super conservative. If it was a CWD positive deer, but a coyote got to it, or a hunter harvest occurred, we would just call those hunter harvests, predation events, whatever. Or if it had HD, we'd say that was an HD death. And so, but even with that, 33% of them was solely CWD, was the factor that we could actually identify in those deaths.
Welcome to Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. I'm Jacob Dykes.
And I'm Eric Mitchell, and we're the co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab.
As hunters, deer biologists, and wildlife professors, we're passionate about bridging the gap between research and management.
Each episode, we explore the latest deer research from around the country, breaking it down to discuss how it can improve wildlife and habitat management on your land.
Whether you're a hunter, a land steward, or simply interested in deer biology, Deer University is for you. And we're back. Eric, what is this? 4, 5 episodes since we've taken over?
Something like that.
Something like that, right? It's been fun. It's going by quick,
great.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know why we don't just walk around mic'd up all the time. Well, actually, I do know why.
I know exactly why we don't walk around mic'd up all the time.
We'd probably not have a job, but you get what I'm saying. We're talking, if I'm not talking deer management throughout the day, I'm talking about food and sometimes even together. So, yeah. So it's always fun to jump on here. It's been a lot of fun. Today is going to be, I'm excited about this one. We've got Mr. Cory Gray and Dr. Marcelo Jorge with us, and we're gonna talk about some really interesting things today. So welcome, gentlemen. We appreciate y'all being here with us.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks.
Yeah. We've been looking forward to this one. So Cory, we'll kick it off with you. Would you mind just telling the listeners a little bit about yourself, what you do, where you're from, that kind of thing?
Yeah, my name's Cory Gray. I currently serve as chief of our research division for the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission. Our agency's divided up into different divisions or departments, and I oversee one of them. It's the research division, and it's made up of a group of highly specialized individuals. I have social science under my umbrella. I have science support. I have a landscape ecologist, and then I have wildlife health. And so that's kind of what brings us here today. I've been with the agency nearly 26 years. Most of my career, I was a state deer biologist for many years. I did do a little tour of duty as the elk coordinator for a while, but then went right back into deer. And then this opportunity came open, and I went into this position in 2017.
Very cool.
Yeah. And just to kick off what I'm doing. So yeah, I'm just a new assistant professor here at the University of Georgia, an extension specialist. Kind of cut my teeth in North Florida, looking at how prescribed burns impact the wildlife communities there and how we can alter their distributions through burning. And then, the big thing that we're going to talk about today, I did my PhD here at the University of Georgia on this Arkansas chronic wasting disease study that we just wrapped up recently.
Yeah, y'all both done some really cool stuff. We've been running in the same circles for years, but it's always, you sit down in this scenario and say, hey, oh yeah, where are you from? What exactly is your title? So it's always fun to catch up like that. So yeah, y'all just wrapped up a big project, and that'd be an understatement, a huge project that's going to have some huge implications.
I would say we've been saying it's the largest project and the most expensive project that our agency has ever tackled. It was huge. And we've been fortunate to have always a foot in the research game in our agency, even with chronic wasting disease. But this one was definitely too big to fail. And that was when we first met with the University of Georgia, went over there, and that was the number one message is like, look, guys, there is no plan B with this project. We must do it. And so they really came through for us.
Well, we're gonna dive into the details here in a second, but well done. Yeah, it was a giant project. Like I told you, I read I think it was a 180-page report. Yeah, a massive project. and a very important project as well. I mean, it was impressive the way that y'all went about it and the success that y'all had with it. So yeah, so today we're going to talk about chronic wasting disease and a big project. So when exactly did it wrap up?
2025, just in June. Yeah, just right around June.
Okay,
I think they gave us the report maybe in June.
Yep. Nice. Well, lucky us. Yeah.
This is hot. I mean, it's right off the press. It's hot.
Nice. Well, what? Let's go a little background. I feel like we've said it quite a few times, but I think still people are learning about it for the first time. But chronic wasting disease, I mean, what is it?
Yeah, I'll start us off, and Marcelo, I'll run out of talent real quick, and so Marcelo will pick up. But it's a fatal neurological disease. It affects members of the Cervidae family, and so in our state, that's our elk and our whitetails. So we're fortunate to have two wild cervid populations in our state. It separates us, I guess, from Mississippi and some others. We brag about being one of the only states out there that you can hunt elk and alligator in.
Yeah, it's wild.
Yeah, it's just the difference in north and south for us. But the thing about that CWD is such unique challenge is that it's not a virus. It's not a bacteria. It's actually a misshapen protein in the body. So the body doesn't have this autoimmune response to it. And it's slow. It takes its time. It's not like, many states right now are struggling with hemorrhagic disease, which is a viral disease. And it comes in like a hurricane, and it's really fast and furious, and it just leaves you kind of stunned. This disease is not that way. It's slow. It's progressing. I think Lindsey Thomas with NDA had one of the best quotes in that, hemorrhagic disease is that red wasp nest sitting at your porch. But then chronic wasting disease is the termites tunneling underneath your foundation. And that's just how this disease operates. It's just what it does. It's a monster of a thing.
Yeah, that's an excellent analogy. And that's a pretty important distinction, that it's not something that you can just kill like a fungus or a bacteria, things like that. And also a lot of those things that we deal with, like hemorrhagic disease, that tends to be seasonal. Whereas CWD is 365 days a year. So there are some really important distinctions that make this complicated and pretty detrimental as well from some of the other things that we deal with.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point in terms of the seasonality of HD versus that constant drumming of chronic wasting disease. And the other big point, just to differentiate the two, is we've had HD on the landscape for over 100 years now, where we've seen populations increase as well as, some declines in some times. Like overall, there hasn't been this drastic population effect. With chronic wasting disease, we're starting to see it, across the board, a unified decline in populations.
Yeah, it's that snowball of, when prevalence hits a certain point, it's just that giant snowball that's rolling down the hill quicker and quicker and quicker, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. We're seeing for sure a larger geographic footprint, and then of course, it's growing stronger and bigger, I guess you could say. Yeah, it's pretty important stuff. I think in Mississippi too, Eric, you can attest to this. We're starting to get a lot more feedback from hunters and people, especially in the north part of our state, that said, "Man, I think we're starting to see some issues." And by we're starting to see some issues, we're not seeing deer anymore.
Yep. Up on the Tennessee line, we're really starting to hear that.
Yeah, we had a landowner up in Marshall County, which is not quite on the lines, a little bit further south, and he's already talking like, "Man, we're just not seeing the deer that we used to see." So I wish we could get those landowners to talk to the ones further south to say, "Hey, we're seeing it. You may want to pay attention to this a little bit." But anyways, so it's important that we have people like y'all that are doing just amazing work to try to figure out and get a grasp on what this is. One, learn more about the disease, what's going on, how is this affecting populations all the way down to fawns and things like that. Now, that's how we're going to, a cooperation of people trying to figure it out and learn more about it. And then, of course, with hunters and things like that, it's going to be a huge team effort. But y'all have, to go ahead and get to diving into y'all's project here. I mean, y'all have done a fantastic job with this project. So we're glad to have you on and discuss it with us.
Yeah, we appreciate it. And like I said, when we did, of course, sent out an RFP, request for proposals on this project, and University of Georgia stepped up and they started partnering. This was a partnership with the University of Georgia at Athens, the Southeastern Cooperative Wildlife Disease Study. Colorado State University was also brought in. So this was such a huge project to take up on. I mean, it was definitely a team approach to all of it. Because I go back to, and I know I preached this to Marcelo when he was living, because they lived amongst us for 5 years, and the technicians, and it's like, look, Marcelo, there is no days off and there is no plan B. This thing has to be successful or they're going to run me out of this state. So we have to get it.
Well, man, we sure appreciate it. I'll speak for myself and all the hunters and everybody else too. We appreciate this kind of work. CWD was discovered back in like 1967 in Colorado, right? And so, as we've progressed, we've seen additional states pick it up. Mississippi, we found it back in 2018. And so, what's the story with Arkansas? What's y'all's story?
Yeah, so we started looking for the disease in our elk in 1997, and so we have a long history of surveillance in our elk. In our whitetails, we started in 2003. And that's probably about the time most of the states, especially the southeastern states, kind of came into the surveillance game. And so the first thing that we did was basically divide the state up into thirds and trying to develop some kind of baseline surveillance for each one of our counties. I think our goal was to pull 50 samples for every county. And we did that over time. And then, surveillance ebbs and flows. Mm-hmm. Some years you may have additional funds, some years you may not. And so you have to go to priorities. Like if I only have X number of funds to spend, how do I want to spend them? And so one thing we did settle in on later was a targeted surveillance approach where we basically said, all right, if you got limited funds, then this is the best way to spend your money. Adult males is, again, a better way to spend your money than, say, a fawn. And so we started really doing this targeted approach, and we detected the disease in 2016. And it was so, we detected both cervid species basically at the same time. And that was what was so odd, in that we had a hunter harvest an elk in October of 2015. And we did not submit that sample until the first of the year, because at that time we were a state that had not detected this disease. And so we held samples until we could batch them together and send many at a time. And at that same time we were getting that result back, we had a call about a clinical whitetail at Ponca. And if anybody knows where Ponca is, I know Marcelo does. That is as far lost as you can be to get to Ponca. We actually own an elk education center there. We have a big elk viewing area, and this clinical whitetail showed up in a little creek behind our center. And the staff there noticed that she was acting odd. She was very thin, but she had this, she had no fear of humans, and she would stand in the water with an A-frame stance with her head down, drinking and urinating at the same time. And so they contacted us. We had a local biologist go up there, and by the time he got to that deer, it was already dead. It was still laying in the water. We pulled a sample. It came back positive, basically the same time as the elk. They were just bam, bam, two whammies right in a row. I always tell the story. We were at the Southeastern Deer Study Group meeting in North Carolina at the Great Wolf Lodge when my phone rang. And we were actually in that meeting on a break. And what was funny is I had just got me a cookie, and I was so excited for this cookie. The story behind that is I was on a diet for a year, and I had not had a cookie. And here I was in a foreign state, and I thought nobody in the world's going to know, that I'm slipping a cookie. So we received the call that we had a CWD suspect individual, and we used the lab at University of Wisconsin. And I saw that lab director, his number pop up on my phone. And so that changed everything with us. What was so odd is that we had this elk that was harvested in 2015. That was positive. But at the same time, we had this whitetail that was clinical at Ponca. And both of those samples came back so close to each other. And as we know, there's different testing out there. There's ELISA, there's IHC, and there's a chemical test, and it takes time for each one of those. And so we're going through those stages, waiting for the results to come back. But the fortunate thing is that we did have a response plan in place. We had developed a response plan in 2006, and that plan had just been sitting on the shelf. And so when we came back from North Carolina, we were in the process of revising that plan. We had instructions like, before you guys come back to Arkansas, that plan needs to be updated, because it had been sitting on the shelf for 10 years. And so this was the days of thumb drives. And so we would stop at a gas station and throw a thumb drive out the window, and the next guy would work on it down the road. Then we'd stop at another gas station and share it that away. But by the time we got back to Little Rock, we had a revised plan. And the first thing that we needed to do was kind of get an idea of where we stood with this disease. And so our plan said that you develop a focal area and you randomly select deer inside that focal area. And so we moved staff and we deployed staff to Newton County, which is just like, we were really focused north of Jasper along the Buffalo National River. And the only instructions that our staff had at that time was to shoot brown deer. And they did. They did a very good job at this. And they harvested 266 deer in around 10 days. And when we got those samples back, we discovered that we had a 23% prevalence. And so that's phenomenal. That's a, that'll take your breath away when you get that phone call. And some of the interesting things about that, when you look at those results by age structure, of course, and by sex, of course, our males had a higher prevalence than the females. The males, though, what was really interesting, we could not find a 3.5-year-old male. And this is staff out at night vision, thermals, everything, all the tools and equipment, but we could not find a 3.5-year-old buck. And we just started thinking about, well, they just not there? Is this disease at such a high prevalence? And one thing we did find, though, is like 29% of the fawns that we harvested were positive. And now these are long fawns. These are not your spotted fawns that you would see in, August. These guys had not had their first birthday yet. So we still called them a fawn, but 29% of those. And so that really got us thinking about, when you take that kind of a impact of this disease on your recruitment and on your future, and you start putting your females in there, because, as we know, as deer managers, it's mouth management, the number of mouths you want on the landscape, but how many boys and girls do you need out there? And that's kind of as simple as deer management can get. But we started really concerned about, with such high prevalence in the females, what is this population going to do in the future? And we wanted to get ahead of it. So we brought together some individuals. We called it a research symposium. We brought them into Arkansas. We actually held it in Russellville. And we had some individuals that we thought was leaders of CWD research in our nation. And we asked them, what's the future of CWD research? All the low-hanging fruit had been picked, but what are the big lingering questions? And the population impact question in the South rose to the top. And we've done a lot of genetic work. We were partners with the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville since 2017, and we have an extensive whitetail deer database for our state. And we've looked at the PRNP gene variant. We know all about deer movements in our state from genetically. But one thing we did not know is what this disease will do down the road at a high prevalence. And so that's where we start. Okay, if you're going to be a bull, you need to be a big one. And this is going to cost us to do it, but we need to have this answer. And so we did a request for proposals at that time, and we met with University of Georgia. I actually went to Athens, and I sit down with Dr. Chamberlain and Dr. Gino and Dr. Chandler, and we talked over this. And Mesa, I was saying, fellas, there is no plan B for this. Like, when we start this journey, we got to see it all the way through, because it's that big for our agency, and we're going to invest in it. It's a huge financial investment, of course, but it's a time investment that we're willing to put our management in that area on hold, on pause, to let this research move through. And so for 5 years, we've not changed bag limits in that area. We've not changed anything, trying to preserve that time capsule, if you will, with deer management during this project. So that's kind of what got us to this point, in that, that disease, when you look at it, it wants to do this ecology growth kind of thing. It wants to do that. And those states that can find it at low prevalence, that's a great blessing.
Mm.
We came in at 23% prevalence. So we came into the game where this disease had already established itself. And now what do we do with this? And, a lot of people said, well, just let it do its course. Just let it. But I didn't feel like that was an option. I mean, if my kitchen's on fire, I'm just not going to let it say, well, I'm just going to let it burn the whole house down. I hope it works out. I'm going to fight it what's in the kitchen, and I'm going to try to stop it, or I'm at least going to try to mitigate it. And we felt the same way with this disease, in that we needed to learn before we took any action, but we did need to do some kind of action.
Yeah, absolutely. And you hit on a couple of really good points there as you were telling that story. One, y'all had been sampling since the late 90s.
Yeah.
And you find it in 2016. That's great that, we want to encourage states not to get complacent, because it can happen just like that. And when you found it, it was much worse. You didn't find the first one, by any means, right? And then also that clinical deer that you found, for some of our listeners that may not know exactly what that means. I mean, you're talking about a deer that has had it for a long time and is sick. It is showing the signs of sickness and actually dying from that disease. You often hear people say, well, there's no deer that are dying from CWD. Yeah, that's an interesting story. And another good point to that is y'all reached out to all of the other states and collaborated and tried to learn and say, okay, well, let's get on the same page. I think that's another important thing for us to know, and for some of the listeners to know, like, hey, we're all working together on this thing. So, I mean, y'all, that's a really interesting story, and man, what a build up to a project that had to be done.
And I think the interesting part there is despite the effort, like, we know that CWD is a hard disease to detect. And so that kind of consistent sampling and surveillance is necessary. The experience that Arkansas saw, it's the same across many other southeastern states where their first detection was already in the 20s, 30% prevalence rate. It just shows you how difficult it is to find, even when we're actively working for it.
Yeah. And that's another great example of, we've got some research that shows that, we absolutely, please, hunters, submit samples, but also that targeted approach of actually having people go out to what we would call a hot zone or ground zero, whatever you want to call it, and actually do a very strategic harvest of those animals tends to provide a better picture of what's truly going on than just harvested individuals from hunters, right? And y'all showed that. We've seen that a couple of other states too.
Cory, how big of an area was it that you all were targeting when you went in and shot that 200 plus sample size initially?
Yeah. I don't remember how many total acres. So our plan said that we would draw a 5-mile radius around the sample. What was unique to us is that the elk and the whitetail were so close to each other that when you drew the 5-mile radiuses, the outside edges touched. So we took both of them in, and it formed this racetrack kind of shape. And so it was basically 2 5-mile radiuses together. And that was the focal area that we had. And again, our staff did a tremendous, fantastic job in our partnership with the National Park Service. They were so gracious to us, because we basically moved all of this equipment in. And then also, I cannot go without saying the private landowners in that area, because they said, here's the keys to the gates. Y'all go in. They knew the urgency behind this, and we would have public meeting updates every day in Jasper. And that was one of the things we promised people, is that we will never leave or forsake you, that we started this together, we will end this together. But those local landowners up there really stepped up and helped us. And we saw the same thing with this project, that
Absolutely.
When we needed help, they were there to help.
Yeah. Well, Eric and I try to make a point with every one of these podcasts to make sure that people know, the public, hunters, landowners, land managers, they are the most important management tool that we have by far. If it wasn't for their support and their help, boots on the ground with this stuff, anything to do with deer or habitat management, I mean, we wouldn't have any traction whatsoever.
Yeah. And if you look at like the number of first detections, where they came from, vast majority of them are hunter harvested deer. And so that just shows the role that they play in this disease, not only from a detection standpoint, but then later on we were talking about management and mitigation. hinges on their efforts and what they do.
Yeah, we try to thank them each episode. Yeah, couldn't do it without them.
I'll never forget when we first detected this disease, we brought in, again, several experts just trying to help us get your bearing. And I'll never forget, I'm not going to say their name, but they told us, and they said as bluntly as I've ever seen anyone say it, but they said, if the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission thinks that you can manage this disease without the support of your hunters, you are all fools. And that resonated with me. And so we just took that to heart as we started this journey. And because again, we can't do it by ourselves.
100%. So this area in the state, so you're talking Northwest Arkansas, correct? What does that look like? Is that a more difficult area to do research like this, or is it easy? Or I mean, we're starting to get into a little bit of terrain there, right? Maybe rougher terrain, or
Yeah. We didn't get to use a helicopter. I'll say that much. Well, this is not, South Texas or South Florida. There was some rugged terrain there. You're in the Ozark Mountains. The road systems are sometimes limited. And so we're hiking in rocket net equipment, sometimes a mile in to get to a good field where we know we can get a lot of deer. And it was absolutely rugged. And then the weather. We had multiple polar vortex events where we were out there in blizzards catching deer, And there was a lot more human and deer safety concerns when we're out there in kind of more extreme conditions. And so, I don't think anything about this was easy compared to a lot of other deer studies I've been a part of. This is like, we turned the difficulty level up to 11 for every single thing. And I warned every technician of ours that if you've done deer research before, this one's going to be a little bit different. And not only in the terms of the intensity of our capture, in terms of man hours, but also the sophistication, adding that kind of disease component to your regular deer capture work. And even when we're talking about necropsies, it was a much more intense necropsy and mortality investigation than other research kind of normally does.
And that's a good point, too. When you're dealing with disease mitigation, you're talking about everything is more complicated. Making sure you're using clean equipment and not further spreading the disease, right? I mean, so I've been a part of nothing like this at all, but anytime you add a biosafety factor into any of this stuff, it makes it a little more complicated. Got to be a little more diligent with the things that you do. Yeah.
Then one other challenge that they had immediately was we had several great plans, but this project started during COVID. It was right at when COVID hit. And so immediately things had to adjust because we started basically in February of 2020. And then, the world came up on its heels of March or April. We could not get equipment. We were struggling with vehicles. All of those challenges that we faced with COVID, these researchers and this team had to live through that as well.
Yeah. With no plan B.
And then again, Marcelo could not tap out on this.
No.
Yeah. It always research looks so good on paper. Everything works out so well on paper.
Yeah.
Never goes that way.
The amount of hours I spent just trying to find nitrile gloves for us to use in the field. I mean, you think about all the medical equipment and the supplies at that time, it was a nightmare on something we just think is so easy to get, 100% of the time.
Gloves, alcohol bottles, you know what I mean? Yeah. And that's standard stuff.
Yeah. And biosecurity wise, I mean, we had different tools and equipment for each deer. So we wouldn't, use the same equipment across multiple deer. And so, I just added every possible level of difficulty associated with that kind of research. But I kind of jumped in on it. With my PhD, I wanted to go big and do something all out. And so I told them, I was like, I'm in it for the long haul. Let's get it done. And so I'm always about that kind of chaos and that craziness of adding additional stressors.
Well, good for people like you that jump into the fire there. Well, before we jump into, I'd like to know like the objectives, if you would, and we can go step by step. We can parse those apart, of course, or we can just list them out and that kind of thing. But do you feel any sense of relief now that you finished this project and now we're getting to run our mouths about it, right?
Yeah, I think like, I miss it now. We're Where, professors, we're not going to be out there doing that crazy stuff in the field anymore. So you kind of look back at it super fondly. During the time you're cussing and you're like, I get real stressed out about the situation. But I think more so, I'm just happy that we got it done, got that information. And now, like you said, we're starting to share that out with everyone. And I think that's the most important piece of this whole thing. Despite all the work we did, it doesn't really end until we can get this information out to everyone.
Eric and I talk about that all the time. That's one of the biggest reasons for this podcast is, nobody's downloading papers for $49.95 on Google Scholar, right? And again, we talk about how integral the public is to all of this. Like, we've got to make sure that once those papers are published and reports and all that, the job's only halfway done. We got to get that information out to the hunters and to the general public and that kind of thing, which is exactly what we're going to do today. So, well, you want to jump into some objectives and just kind of spell that out, and we'll go through maybe some of the methodology too that you used, which is really fascinating. And
so we had a couple objectives, and that 180-page document that you looked at, it actually had 2 bonus objectives that weren't even included in that. So we just wanted to keep it under 200-page document for everyone. But the first objective is really just getting at abundance and what would the abundance look like in the CWD management zone in that area. And so we took estimates across the years there. We then did survival and cause-specific mortality to kind of look at how is this disease impacting their survival, annual survival, and survival across time, as well as what are the causes of death, right? How much is CWD playing a role in terms of actually killing the deer versus being a exacerbating factor to the disease? I mean, we know it's fatal, so it is, but compared to having predators on the landscape and other diseases, we wanted to see that kind of comparison. And that included both fawn and adult survival. And then we also wanted to look at their kind of movement resource selection. Is obviously, when we're talking about prion diseases, they're shedding, the deer's movement is tied to kind of the transmission of that disease because they're shedding these prions across the landscape and interacting with deer. And so we wanted to look at kind of that movement component as well. And then obviously we also have like the infection rates. What are we looking at prevalence wise? How many more deer are getting infected year by year? And then this would ultimately all kind of come together in a larger integrated population model so that we could kind of predict and estimate what that population is going to look like out into the future, and as well as across different management prescriptions. What if, AGFC altered bag limits or added APRs or removed APRs, antler point restrictions. And so those were kind of the main objectives that we had there. But we also had, I just had not enough things to do. So I added a couple more objectives. And so because there's environmental transmission where there's a potential for that, we also wanted to look at what the scavenging community looked like and what species might be playing a role in moving these prions further as well. Those are kind of the big objective points of what we were doing.
And that's a whole book.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Understanding our listeners might not fully understand the gravity of everything you just said, but it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work.
Yeah. And I think we thank all the technicians that were out there doing that work, because the number, just data management, when we're talking about that, from the collar locations to, we had 243 cameras out on the landscape across 3 grids. And we kind of went from, where they first detected the disease there and kind of stepped away a little bit further out into suspected lower prevalence areas. And so we had these kind of 3 grids in like a high, medium, low situation. And so you're just multiplying all the work by 3. And these camera grids were out there year round, operating year round. So we're checking them once a month, changing batteries, SD cards, all that. And that's the easy part, because afterwards we got now over 7 million photos altogether that I went through personally, 1 million by myself. But we also, utilized AI to start doing some species detections and kind of helping us go through there. But we'd always have to hand check everything afterwards as well. The amount of work everyone put into it, not just us, obviously AGFC staff were there too. And we'd ask them sometimes to come help us in terms of capture or mortalities. There was public help and support that they'd be calling us in saying, I've harvested, where do I need to bring this to you guys? So it was a community effort, and it can't get done without that kind of multiple communities coming in together.
No, that is a huge undertaking just to get it started, and that I think a lot of people don't understand. Once you get the data in, you know what I mean? You can't just flip through 7 million pictures, you know what I mean? And yet, y'all also were collaring deer and getting GPS data, which I'd love to hear about as well. But we're talking millions and millions of data points that have to be combed through.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were, we'd catch the deer, we'd collar them. We had ear tags so that we could detect them on the cameras. We would take live samples of CWD. So some of the audience might not be familiar, but you can test for CWD without dispatching the animal through the remote sample. And it's a rectal biopsy sample that we can take without harming the animal. We could also do tonsils as well, but we focus mostly on remote because we were doing repeated captures of these same individuals across the year to see when and if they did develop the disease over that time. But we also, went out there, and after calling both bucks and does, we did some fawn capture as well with those same individuals. And so we have this amazing data set. We have multiple recaptures of these same individuals. We have the fawns that they birthed. And so we can look at fawn survival that's tied to a mother's CWD status, as well as just the adults' survivability in that area as well. I remember a time during the summer there, though, I didn't sleep for 48 hours because my phone would be ringing from, a fawn's being born to these other adult deer were dying. And then we'd go out and opportunistically look for fawns. And so there was a 48-hour stint there where I was just jumping around, catching fawns, doing cause-specific mortality work that, you just kind of have to get there at a reasonable time before a lot of that evidence starts going away.
And
Absolutely.
To double down on that, I think just to make sure everybody's clear, what was so unique about this project is that at the point of capture, like Marcelo was saying, they would take a sample out of the rectum, of this gland, and then that deer would be collared with a GPS collar and turned loose. And so the researchers knew who on the landscape was CWD positive and who was negative. And so we could stand back at this mile-high view and watch what deer do. And we were the only ones knowing who out there was positive and who was negative. And it kind of gave you this control and treatment animal at the same time, and you could just see their movements. And then they would go back and attempt to recapture these animals annually to see if they ever became CWD positive through the life of the project. And so I think that's just a great point to be able to say, only we knew who on the landscape was positive and negative through this whole study. And we could just be these observers and just see how life impacted them, how the weather impacted them, how the terrain impacted them, because it did. When we get into the conversation of the results, we could see all of those factors and how they played into just the daily lives of these individuals.
And on top, to add to that point too, we kind of wanted hunters to harvest these deer as they would normally. And so we made a great effort there to kind of let them know, yes, they have collars, but if that's a deer you would normally harvest, go ahead and do that. So we could accurately estimate kind of what that harvest number is for that population when we're talking about, future population trends. You don't want to bias it by saying, okay, no one touch any deer, because that's not realistically what's happening on the landscape, right? And so it was important for us to just say, if you want to harvest it, go ahead. And thanks to the great support we got there from the public, they would call in and kind of give us the information afterwards. It was a funny story. So this is a wasting disease, and they deplete their fat reserves over this long period of time, but it's also a neurologic disease. So there's that cognitive function that's declining over that same time. And so that was actually one of the one of the objectives I kind of added on there was looking at these vigilance rates. And this came about because one of the hunters in the local area, they called us saying, hey, we got a deer, but we had recently received some of our CWD samples back. And when we found out what deer it was, we were like, oh, we knew that one was positive. And so I had him ask, was there anything weird or strange about this deer when you went to harvest? He's like, well, now that you say that, he said he had just come off the tree stand, was kind of walking back to his truck, walking through the middle of the field, not really caring about what was happening. And then he got within 40 yards of this deer, stared it down eye to eye, and then decided to crawl on his hands and knees with his bow, got within 20 yards of this deer, raised up, pulled back, and took a shot. This deer started running towards him, stopped after like 10 yards, and then kind of slightly jogged away, right? And so to me, I'm like, oh, I can tell you why that happened. Like, you're not the greatest hunter in the world, you know. I have to break that to you. But yeah, so that kind of just shows you that cognitive decline, because it looked like a relatively healthy and normal deer, but cognitively it was just not there anymore. And that's another big aspect of the disease that I think, you know, needs more discussion and kind of research into, is those timelines.
Absolutely. That excellent points on y'all knew positive and not detected, but you left it alone after that and let whatever was going to happen. But, you know, that's a great point, Marcelo, that we talk about a lot, is even though that deer may appear to be healthy, they are steadily declining with that disease. It takes months and a year or more for it to actually look sick. But in the head, they are not that, you know, that instinctual prey species that's working on all cylinders just to survive, right? They're declining.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you have these environmental factors, and we can talk about that. But Marcelo and them found that we did have 2 polar vortexes events, just extremely low temperatures during this study. And you could just see that life is already hard for a whitetail. But when you have a fatal neurological disease, it's even harder. And that they would be these life events that would just flip the switch on them, like their body couldn't handle anymore. And if you know, we always thought about in the South being our extreme temperatures in the summer, that if you were already clinical, and then you had to go through, say, a 30-day period of time where temperatures was going to be 95 and above, is that just too much for the body to handle? And so we were able to get in those kind of fine-tuned details with our data, because their locations and the mortality events that they were able to track. And so we were able to monitor those environmental changes in relation to this disease.
Yeah, that's really cool. And that was another thing that I learned when I read through this report. Again, it's somewhat intuitive, but not something you would think about. You know, before we dive any deeper, Marcelo, you had mentioned that you didn't sleep a lot because you were getting calls that fawns were hitting the ground. How did you know about the fawns hitting the ground?
Yeah, so we used vaginal implant transmitters. When we captured the does, we essentially have this transmitter that once a doe gives birth during the summer, it would send us a signal to our phones and our emails, and we were just always on them, waiting. And so we could tell when they gave birth, and then we would go out there and actually go look around for that fawn. And we used some thermal scopes, which actually greatly helped our kind of process and how quickly we could get to them. And so we'd go out there, and then when we, found the fawns, we would actually additionally give them VHF collars, very high frequency collars. And so then that kind of added to the work, because within the first couple weeks of their life, we were going and checking on these fawns through their collars 3 times a day. And so when you think about, 80 plus deer or 80 deer on the landscape for any given year, and then they're, half of them were getting fawns. Yeah, we had a lot of fawns to cover there, a lot of fawn mortality in the Southeast compared to, some of the northern states. And so we would be running around a lot during the summer, on top of, checking cameras periodically as well. But yeah, so we use vaginal implant transmitters to kind of let us know when they did give birth, or if they didn't give birth, which is important as well.
Sure, yeah. And so those transmitters, when they give birth, they're pushed outside the body. And that change in temperature from inside and outside the body will actually send off a signal and say, hey, this doe's giving birth.
Yeah.
That's another really cool piece of technology for this project.
Technology on this project was just fantastic. I mean, I kept saying, this is Star Trek stuff. I mean, this is, because we all remember going out there on the VHF with the antennas and listening, and then, doing these big fawn drives. But this project, I felt like the plan that they had and the plan they implemented was cutting edge on every aspect of it. And I think it took that level of technology to actually be successful.
Yeah. So remind us, how many deer did you have collared in total over the 5-year project?
Yeah. So across all the deer, we had roughly 400. We put hands on over 400 deer. But that includes our collared adults in the 200 range, and then as well as every deer we captured, we gave ear tags to, and we took a CWD sample, because later on we'd actually potentially catch them again. And so we went out there and got 400. And then we had our juveniles, anything under 1.5 years old, as well as, hundreds of couple hundred fawns as well under study. I don't actually have the exact numbers on me right now, but yeah, it's quite a lot.
Wow.
It's a lot of deer.
Yeah, it's a lot to keep track of as well.
And in this terrain, like we mentioned earlier, the Ozark Mountains is not a place to be doing this, especially that part of the Ozarks. This is not kind of the foothills of the eastern region of the Ozarks. This was right in the heart of it. And it's a closed canopy system with kind of a mosaic open field component to it. But this was extreme. And then the tick loads, I don't know how the tick loads they carried. When we say those kind of things about 400 deer, put 400 deer in the Delta, that's a different challenge than 400 deer captured in the Ozarks.
Oh, absolutely. And this is all public land as well, because there is a difference between capturing deer on public versus private land in terms of some of the disease, right? There's a lot more pressure at times. But to the point about ticks, I mean, we're picking off ticks for days, all day and all night. And we'd actually saw with the fawns that there were some that were just inundated with ticks as well. So much so that I remember this example that the fawn's eyes were just completely covered in ticks. They were kind of swollen shut. And so when we went to capture it, we didn't have to chase it or run or do anything. We just picked it up and didn't even realize we were kind of there. And later on, when we did a squidus necropsy of that individual, we did find that there was sepsis. So it could have been introduced by those lesions that the ticks left. And so we don't really think about ticks as being that big of an issue in terms of their survival. I mean, obviously diseases that they're associated with too, but just the sheer number of ticks on that one fawn kind of sealed its fate in that situation there. Yeah, I've been, South Florida, North Florida, Virginia, New York, nothing in terms of the number of ticks I've seen there in Northwest Arkansas.
Yeah, being a whitetail is tough. And then you throw a fatal neurological disease in the mix.
It just adds.
Yeah. So let's cover whatever. If we've missed anything, please fill us in here. I think we've got a good understanding of kind of how you went about it, what you were trying to accomplish here. You had a few different study areas that you had named that were in that overall target area, of course. So what did you start seeing, as far as your objectives?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing we saw there, so I guess we'll just start with roughly the prevalence rates in that area. So across all the area, we were looking at a 50% prevalence at this point now. So if you remember when they first detected it, they were at a little over 20%. And now we're talking about 50% prevalence. And largely our hypothesis that, the areas closer to that first detection would have higher prevalence. And then as you moved away, it would kind of drop down. We did see that mostly correctly. We got it right in terms of Irby being at the highest prevalence rate. But then Gene Rush and Tyler Bend, which are sites that were a little bit further east, they were kind of similar, but they were lower than Irby. And so that kind of followed that idea that we would expect that, okay, that is the hot spot near Irby where they first detected it. And then over time, as we get further away, the prevalence lowered a little bit. And then I think the other big point about this is when we looked at abundance rates, and then the abundance rate changes over time. And so what we do is in this integrated population model, in this abundance model, we took the abundances across different sites and across the different years. And we actually just plotted them out to see, okay, is it changing? Is it stable? Is it increasing? And what we found was that our population growth rate was at 86%. So roughly declining on average at 14% per year across the years that we saw this, that we studied it. So I will say with a caveat that this is a snapshot in time, right? And a lot of things change as density changes in terms of disease prevalence and contact rates. All these things might change. So shouldn't be like, okay, just do 14% every year until you see what's going to happen in 30 years, because all these things change. Within that snapshot, we did see those kind of large a decline over time there. And again, we actually saw that the sites that were further away from that hotspot in Gene Rush and Tyler Bend, they were declining at a little bit less than in Irby. which we kind of now hypothesize that it's kind of gone over the big hump, and there's already been that big die off. And now at Irby, they're starting to kind of flatline and find that resistance from the bottom, because despite the impacts of CWD on the adult population, we actually saw that another point was survival for fawns was relatively the same, regardless of whether your mother had or didn't have CWD. And so it shows that there's that kind of silver lining where there's always going to be that input into the population, although there's all, negative effects as well. I kind of spit a lot at you there, so maybe we can
No, that was good.
That was great.
And you mentioned population decline.
Yeah,
but that's one thing we hear a lot from people. Well, whatever it is, okay, CWD, this, that, and everything else, at least it's not causing population declines. It is.
It is. And that's been the case, whether you look in Wyoming or Colorado, whether you're looking at mule deer or elk or whitetails, that kind of story has been fairly constant across these regions and across these species. And so we weren't really expecting it to be wildly different in Arkansas, but we had to make sure that we do see it and what are the rates looking like there.
Well, that's part of science too, right? You're replicating in a totally different environment, and that's what gives credence to the other studies and to yours, is you're finding similar results in a different part of the country. So that's really important.
100%.
Yeah, I was going to follow up with some of that, because Marcelo he just laid out some gold nuggets of this project. But when he talked about lambda, we know lambda is like that what the population is doing, like a 1.0 means it's stable. Our lambda is a 0.86, so it means we're losing 14% of that population annually. I mean, that's huge. So you start thinking about all the other things that a whitetail has to deal with. And then now it has this on top of it. And so that's what's causing that. And so that's things that a manager can now grasp a hold of. As if you went to a hunting club somewhere and you said, look, you're losing 14% of your deer herd annually. You're bleeding out 14%. They'd say, well, let's stop the bleeding. Where'd I go for that? And so they were able to provide us information that's going to go into the management, and we'll get into the management here in a little bit conversation. I don't get the cart in front of the horse here, but that's things that we can grasp onto as deer managers, that you could say, well, here's where you're losing your deer. Here's where you're bleeding out deer. And then you could address that. So I just think that's a huge point. I also think that the fawn issue, we did not see really a big difference on fawn survival rates. And it amazes me what takes a fawn. Fawn, Lord have mercy on a fawn, right? I mean, everything in the world is out after a fawn. But what is interesting to me is that the does will continue on and on. That motherhood will continue on, and they're going to be breeding and trying to raise that offspring right up to the very end. And it's almost like in my head, I know this is stupid and simple, but it's almost like that motherhood will overcome the disease. Like we thought, I'll just say, I thought that maybe a CWD mother she just couldn't raise one. She couldn't make a good decision. She didn't know where to hide it. She just couldn't be a good mother. But it seems like, though, that motherhood is so strong that they're still in the game, and they're still trying to ensure something's going to come after her. And I don't know. I thought that was a fascinating point of the project, is like, we didn't see that difference between a CWD negative and a CWD positive, or CWD not detected and CWD positive.
And I think that kind of speaks to that innate motherhood behavior that's within them. I mean, we had instances where, they died during birth with birth complications, but their body condition was so horrible at that time. I was amazed it was even attempting to give birth. Mm. Or some that gave birth to a fawn and a few days later succumbed to the disease as well. And so it's like, it's such an ingrained thing biologically, physiologically, that it seems like they were going to do it no matter what, disease be damned. And so that's yeah.
Well, Eric and I touched on an episode an episode or two ago, where we talked about how difficult being a mother was anyways. Late summer stress, the nutritional requirements being through the roof. Then you throw this in the mix. I do think it's fascinating that they still were willing to sacrifice it all to make sure that fawn makes it, right?
Yeah, no, it's amazing. And so kind of getting to we kind of outlined, right, that there was this decline happening. And so then the next kind of question to that is, what is the major driver of that decline, right? And we kind of hinted at it already, where fawn survival, we saw numbers that are pretty standard across the Southeast. I mean, yes, they're getting hit by coyotes. That was a major source of mortality, but that's the case throughout the Southeast and in many other parts as well. And so, okay, we know it's not fawns. So then we look at these adults, and that's when we really start seeing those differences pop out in terms of their survival rates. So for prevalence, right, we had, as we talked about before, the bucks had higher prevalence at around 68% compared to does at 32%. But the impacts on their survival rates were just kind of astounding, where, a doe's at in the 80s, if it's not detected, it's a healthy doe there, but it'll drop down to the 60s if it has CWD. And then bucks were even lower because obviously they're getting harvested and they're moving around a lot more. And so they might start out in the 60s and then respectively drop down to 45% annual survival probability, right? And so when we think about how that population operates over time, specifically with the does, that loss of one doe, it's actually a loss of 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4 deer when we start calculating the fawns that it should have had, right? And so over time, when we start looking at the kind of variation in population of where it should have been had that doe not died, those effects start accumulating as those new doe fawns don't produce as well. And so you can get a wildly different projection of where your population should be just from losing a doe versus bucks.
Yeah, and that was something that it's intuitive, but it kind of blew my mind too. I guess I just hadn't thought much about that. But yeah, those does had several years left to produce potentially twins, triplets, whatever it may be. So you've got to think about those deer now not being born. I mean, that was a huge takeaway for me.
Well, and that ties right back into basic deer management, right? That's why we concentrate on harvesting does. We want to decrease the population because they make the offspring, they raise the offspring, right? But when you start decreasing the lifespan and you have that complicated or that factor of just not having nearly as many fawns and offspring in the future, it really impacts that population a lot.
Yeah, with no control. Usually we are making recommendations.
Mm-hmm.
Take this many does, whatever it may be. And now you're talking about something that's just zapping them. And the bucks, another big thing for hunters here, a lot of the people we're working with, I mean, myself included, I like antlers too. I like a healthy deer herd. I like big, fat, older does. And I like, mature bucks. And the bucks are much more likely to die from this disease than the does are. So if you're out there managing, hoping to, grow antlers and that kind of thing, this is a big deal.
And it's shortening those lifespans. So from that doe perspective, it's just not producing as many fawns over its life. But from that buck perspective, is you're not even hitting, your maximum potential in antler growth. And so when we're talking about these shortened lifespans, there's implications from all sorts of sides, whether you're a trophy hunter or you're a meat eater. This is going to impact multiple aspects of that deer population. And we need to be aware of that and careful about it.
Excellent point.
Yeah, some of our prevalence, Marcelo, if I'm not mistaken, I think the yearlings was like in the 20s, 20% prevalence in the yearlings. It jumps considerably at 2.5-year-old buck. 50% of those were CWD positive. 3.5-year-old is 65%. So, what do you do with that? Is, if you're trying to manage for an older age class buck, well, 50% of them is going to be positive. And we've had landowners in that area say, every buck I've harvested has been positive. And so that kind of adds to the human dimensions of this disease. How do you promote deer management in this area when half of your 2.5 years is going to be positive? And that's some of the difficult conversations that we have, and that especially in Newton County, Arkansas, where we go to landowners and they're asking for some help. In that Irby area, they found the deer abundance was 1.5 deer per square mile. You can't hunt that. I mean, if you had a square mile and you say, look, there's a deer and a half in there, go get him. I mean, and you hope he's not positive when you get him. And so that's some of the conversations that we're having. And I know there's individuals out there that will look at this disease and zoom out. Say, well, the whole state of Arkansas is fine. When they find 200 and something or whatever it may be positives annually, but they harvest 200,000 deer. CWD is a drop in a bucket. And you can zoom out that far, but if you get it down to that individual landowner and you go to a landowner that's in Irby, where that density is 1.5 deer per square mile, and you start talking about what are you seeing on your game cameras and how fun is your hunting in this property. And that's really where the rubber meets the road, is that individual that you're looking eye to eye with, and you're trying to keep them in the game and keep that passion of deer hunting going. And that's really where some of the most difficult conversations take place. Is, yeah, I can minimize that landowner and say, well, it's not a big deal. Look at the whole state of Arkansas. But he's not going to buy that.
No.
He's saying, what about my property? And that's where we're seeing some of the most difficult conversations take place.
A deer or two per 640 acres.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is unbelievable. And most people are hunting tracts that are much, much, much smaller than that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, how would you like to pay that lease amount? I mean,
golly,
that's not going to be fun to write that lease check.
And you want to talk about like the difficulty in deer capture. That area was the most difficult place to ever catch a deer that I've been in. But I want to give tons of credit to those hunters and landowners in that area, because despite all that, they're still out there and they're still harvesting. They're still getting at it to some extent. And so it's like they're putting an effort regardless of how insurmountable some of that stuff is. And that's necessary, especially when we're talking about good deer management. In a CWD zone, we don't want to have, I mean, obviously density is super low there, but in other areas, we don't want to have those populated populations out there before it gets there, right? Because then it's just a tinderbox and explode. And so, the fact that hunters are still willing to go out there, even after that kind of first detection back in 2015, it might have helped a little bit despite how bad things look right now.
Sure. And as a deer biologist and a hunter, that's sad. That hurts my feelings to hear that. Man, that's rough. So y'all had mentioned, or go ahead, Eric.
Well, I was just going to say, Cory, you made you talked about that argument of it's being so localized, right? It's not really impacting all of Arkansas. We hear that for so many different states. Well, really, when you zoom in on it, it's just one part of the state. But that's assuming it doesn't spread. And we know it spreads. We're estimating in Mississippi, it spread about 3 miles a year. So it doesn't take a whole lot of time to also have a much larger impact. And you see that. I mean, I just came down from Minnesota. We look at the disease up there, and every year there's a new hotspot. Wisconsin, same thing. This disease spreads, and it's only a matter of time before it continues to spread. And that's, I think, something that people just don't think about.
Yeah, 100%. And that is the point of all of this, is how can we figure out a better way to slow the rate of spread? You know what I mean? Like, because it is spreading. It may not be your problem right now, but it very well may be in 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, and I think
important.
It's not a blanket. So, whatever management application you apply, you can't blanket it. So what we look at in high prevalence counties will be totally different than what we look at, say, on the outside on low prevalence counties. And the low prevalence counties are the ones that you tend to get the most pushback because they don't see the impact, because this disease is just a slow drip of individuals. And so those low prevalence counties are saying, well, I don't see any. Why am I being impacted? This disease, everybody's mule gets impacted on this disease. So that's a difficult conversation too, when you start talking about the social science aspect of this disease. But really, that's where you can make the most hay, is on those low prevalence areas, is like, let's not let this get out of hand. And if I went to the doctor and the doctor said, Cory, you got cancer, but it's only in one kidney. Well, I'd be a fool to come back to the house and say, well, I'll deal with it when it gets in my liver. No, you handle that right now.
Yeah,
and you get in there and you drag it to the ground and you deal with it right now. You don't let it get out of hand. And so that's some of this, just all states deal with this. It's not just Arkansas, but it's just the nature of this beast that we have here.
Yeah. And I think it's human nature to some extent. If it ain't affected me, then why am I worried about it? The problem with something like this is when it does start to affect you, it's too late at that point, right? And that's what we were talking about earlier. Eric and I were up near Benton County in Mississippi just a week or so ago. And if we could get those landowners, the story that they are telling us of not seeing any deer anymore, because that is where we've got a problem up there with CWD. If the people down in South and Middle Mississippi, Central Mississippi would talk to those people, I think it would open their eyes a little bit. Like, hey, maybe we didn't think about it either, but it's here, and I can promise you, it's not made up.
Yeah, I think that's super important, having those local stories, especially talking to the hunters and landowners up there. I didn't have to explain much of how bad it is because they saw it, so they know. It's the people that are outside in different states or outside of that region that they're like, I've heard of, there's a bunch of podcasts saying a whole bunch of other things too. So it's like, who do they listen to? And the other thing, it's difficult when you're dealing with this kind of cryptic disease, right? Everyone knows and worries about HD because they see it when it's like, oh, there's a pileup of dead deer. Yeah, that's obviously a problem. The issue, and you go to the idea of like the psychology and human dimensions aspect of it, is it's the slow drip, right? It's a frog in a slowly boiling pot there that's starting to get warmer and warmer. That's a much harder issue for people to wrap their brains around, right? It's like saying, comparing HD and CWD, to me, it's like if I go to you when Netflix was just starting and I say, will you buy Netflix for $2,000? You're going to be like, no, that's crazy. I would never do that. But if you had it since it started, you've already paid well over $2,000, right? But that kind of mental game we play where it's like, oh, 2001 shot is bad, but that $10 a month or whatever it, is and starts increasing over time, you actually pay a lot more. And the same idea with chronic wasting disease, it's that slow drip over time that accumulates into, the same thing we love about compound interest rates for like our savings accounts. But it's in the negative aspect here.
Yeah. I mean, it's huge human dimensions issue because it's not a in your face, a bunch of sick zombie, you hear zombie deer and things like that. It's typically not that until it gets to be far too late. And then also there's so much misinformation out there. And that's one thing that I appreciate us being scientists. We're just the messengers. We do the research and we do the outreach to get the results out to people. But yeah, it's a tough thing. It is a tough thing to try to, get people to understand it is a problem. I can understand why it's tough.
We've really invested a lot in the social science aspect of this disease. I've got 2 social scientists, and I think they're the best that's out there. I'll put them in the cage with anybody else. I have that much confidence in them. But we've actually conducted several. We try to do it about every 5 years, but several hunter surveys with opinions regarding CWD because we want to see that over time and to be able to monitor hunter opinion with prevalence because we can divide it out by county and do all these things. So there's some great work being done, not only with us, again, I'm biased, but in the nation on the social science aspect of this disease because it's huge.
And to kind of get back to some of the results, but to tie in this kind of the misinformation, right, is a lot of people believe that it's not CWD that's actually killing these deer and it's something else. And so we made a conscious effort there for our cause-specific mortalities to collect every tissue that we had possible to us, send it to Squidus and have them look, okay, did it have HD? Was it any viruses or bacteria or septic in any other form? And we compared, a gambit of common diseases in deer for every single individual that we got, and we had the available tissue so that we could identify and say, with our sample there, 33% of all CWD positive deer that died solely to CWD. Right? We look at that. We wanted to be super conservative. If it was a CWD positive deer, but a coyote got to it or, a hunter harvest occurred, we would just call those hunter harvests, predation events, whatever. Or if it had HD, we'd say that was an HD death. And so, but even with that, 33% of them was solely CWD was the factor that we could actually identify in those deaths. That from the larger scale, from all the deer that died, that's almost 20% of all deer was purely CWD. And that's not to say, CWD wasn't contributing to predation or to a harvest like that story I talked about before, right? And so we wanted to make sure that we looked at these other diseases in the context of CWD as well. And what we found really was very few HD cases. We didn't have crazy outbreaks. We're having some large outbreaks here in Georgia now and in other areas. But there in Arkansas at the time, we really didn't see many, with only a handful of cases. And what was interesting is we saw no brain abscesses, which are a fairly common disease you would see in a deer population, but we found zero, like absolute zero. And so I think, with CWD decreasing their lifespans and increasing their mortalities, that some of these other diseases were not popping up as common because of CWD is in that area now. But we always wanted to make sure we looked at every other disease and rule out any other option, because that's usually a lot of the talking points we would get. It's like, oh, it's not actually CWD. It's like we ran the gambit on everything else. So what else are you going to tell me it is?
So CWD could be contributing to all other sources of mortality. Tell me again the percentage that you identified that died from CWD.
Just purely CWD from our positive deer was 33% of them. From the total population, so both positive and non-detected, 19.7, 20% of the deer died solely due to CWD.
Wow.
From the entire study system, or all the deer that died.
Were you able to get into any like compensatory versus additive mortality relative to CWD? So in a population, there's going to be a certain number of individuals that are just going to die anyway. And then once you go above that, we call that additive, which oftentimes contributes to declining populations, right? So it sounds kind of like a perfect situation to try to, and it's also very difficult to look at in any research situation, right? Because you can't ever say it's additive versus compensatory, but it seems like there's ever situations you can start to parse out additive mortality. This might be one of those situations.
Yeah. I think a lot of the data suggests that CWD is additive to the system there, and that, if we do normal studies, we just don't have great baselines to compare it to, because that's really the beauty, right? If we had that baseline beforehand to now. But yeah, there's a lot of suggestion that it is additive based on the cause of deaths that we're seeing there. If we had removed all those, we just don't see the relative numbers in the other mortalities in other systems and other studies that would indicate that it's all compensatory and that these deer would have died anyway, right? Plus, we wouldn't have this, I think, large of a decline that we're seeing here.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah.
But yeah, and that was, surprising to me. So, because it works in two different ways, right? Not only is it a fatal disease, so it is a cause of mortality, but it's also this aggregating factor for everything else. And so statistically, research-wise, that makes it a little bit more annoying to deal with, because it's like, okay, do you call this a cause of death, or is this a covariate that influences death in general? But we're actually going to do a little bit more work in the future and kind of flush a little bit more work out there in terms of causes and breaking that stuff down to exposure risks as well.
They also documented too, and Marcelo can give more details, but just some odd things happen. Like, and y'all may have seen the Buffalo River, but it's not like the Mississippi River that separates us. The Buffalo, you could basically wade across it most of the year. There's going to be times that you can't, but it's just your typical Ozark stream. And we would have mature bucks drown in the Buffalo, and they would be CWD positive, but that shouldn't happen for a 2.5-year-old buck. He's at the fit of his fitness, and he should be able to easily navigate that water, because we see them. We know from our other studies that we've done along the Mississippi River, as well as y'all have done studies, where whitetails go back and forth across the Mississippi like it's nothing. But we have deer that struggle across a little stream called the Buffalo River.
And that's, we have the data there where these individuals were crossing it back and forth like it was nothing all before that, But yeah, we had a couple cases there where we had that suspected drownings where they're just found dead in the river. And sometimes I think it was like in 6 inches of water, And so you could tell it literally just collapsed. And then the drowning aspect was because its head's underwater in 6 inches. It really wasn't going to make it. And to get back to the idea of the polar vortex event, right? We had this doe that was just, you could tell from her tracks, she went down, bedded down on the side of a ridge, tried to get back up, took about 3 steps and just keeled over. And again, another just like a CWD positive. They just didn't have any more energy or emphasis to go forward. And then we had we had a buck that got tangled up in a 4-foot high sheep fence, with And it was, again, just another CWD positive. These are abnormal deaths that we really wouldn't expect it to do, at least not this frequently and this often. But like, it should have just jumped over the fence. But I think cognitively, it just, I'm going to walk forward. And then it got stuck with its antlers entangled in the fence there.
All of our listeners have, at this point, I would like to think, have heard of chronic wasting disease, but another name for that or category of disease is, transmissible spongiform encephalopathy. So to paint this picture a little more, we're talking about an animal that is getting holes poked in its brain like a sponge. And so, as you could imagine, it's got to affect all kinds of things before it shows that. So that's pretty interesting to think about. Yeah, drowning in a small stream that they would typically swim back and forth.
Yep.
And it just makes you wonder what all does it influence. And you're talking about a prey animal that everything's trying to eat it already. Man, there's just a lot to that.
And there was an interesting video that the local HFC staff had there too, where, you can approach these deer and they got within, 10 feet of this individual, clapping, yelling at it. And what was interesting to me looking at that is when they made sound, when the deer finally wanted to orientate towards that stimulus, it actually looked the other way, like completely opposite from where the sound was coming from. And so that just shows you that kind of cognitive decline. It just jumbles up a whole bunch of things from sensory to vigilance, that their behavior just starts going wonky. And again, they looked like a normal deer other than it was on the side of the road at 11 o'clock in the afternoon, all by itself next to the road, just foraging, ignoring everyone.
And looks perfectly healthy. I remember when I was in South Texas, TPWD had a video of it was collected off of one of the Ring doorbell cameras, and this deer is clinical. I mean, it's showing all the signs: emaciated, drooling, but it is just standing on the porch, looking at nothing, with a dog behind it barking.
Yeah,
and it eventually walked off in the yard and died. But I mean, it's wild. They're just not there.
You could tell,
they're especially for a prey species. I mean, we're all hunters. How hard is it to trick a deer? And then you talk about some of these instances that we see, and it's like, okay, well, something's off,
wildly wrong. Yeah,
holes in the brain.
And I got a video of when we shot off one of the rocket nets. There was about 9 deer, at this bait site, and one was a little bit further back. And I was like, okay, a couple of the ones further back, they're going to get out, and we'll have a good number. I shot this thing. And it just stood there after the rocket fired off. It just stood there. It wasn't until all the other deer came up to it that it even began to start turning. And so you could tell that it was a just massively delayed reaction and understanding that it was in the same position when we actually drove up to that deer that it was standing in, before the shot even fired.
And without the disease, they react to you releasing an arrow. You know what I mean? They'll drop 6 inches.
Yeah, right. That's how you think. Yeah. It's, I think that's one part of the one aspect that I really think we need to dive more into in terms of research is look at these behavioral changes that are going on. So from our aspect, in terms of the sheer numbers, we didn't see a large difference in the number of deer that were harvested, whether they did or didn't have CWD. And so previous studies have shown at least sometimes a little bit of difference or not much. But then the same with predators too. There have been a couple papers talking about, especially with panthers or pumas, depending on what you want to call them, that they were selectively killing CWD positive individuals. But we really, as far as we've seen so far, are numbers wise, we did a similar methods that they did. In terms of counts, we don't see that difference. But when we start thinking about these kind of exposure times, right, because their lifespans are a lot shorter, they only had 200 days of exposure to potentially being predated on or harvested versus a healthy deer who has 400 days. Then you can see where that kind of the per day risk is actually increased for a CWD positive deer than compared to a negative, right? We would suspect. But like I said, we're going to dive a little bit further into that as more time goes on. We're going to kind of take a deep dive into that and a much broader discussion in terms of all the other diseases that we did detect, because there's some interesting, unique things that Dr. Reuter found with some of our deer that don't necessarily play a role in terms of CWD, but are interesting findings.
Well, and keep me on track here. I may get to rambling. I've got so many questions hitting me right now. But so you mentioned the younger bucks, they had a higher prevalence. why would bucks be more susceptible and younger bucks at that? Any ideas on that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple in terms of when, bucks go into rut and they start going and connecting with does. So this is just generally does versus bucks. We'd expect that they're getting into a lot more contact with a much broader number of individuals. When you're thinking about, well, they're fighting a bunch of individuals, but they're also breeding a bunch of does, but then they have their bachelor herds, where if you think of from a doe aspect, they kind of stay in their little social groups, and there isn't as much contact across social groups, right, for does. Not to say that there's none, but a lot less than I think where bucks are going around a little bit more. That's where I hypothesize a lot of that would come from. And some of the papers kind of discuss that in terms of contact rates.
Like I mentioned earlier, we've have a long standing database now since going back to 2017 with the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville. And we have genetic material from every county in our state. Actually, we've learned that we have 8 genetically different populations of deer in our state. And there are barriers, rivers and roads and urban areas and elevation terrain can cause barriers. But one thing that came out of that study is it gets real sciencey to me, and that gets me off into deep water real fast. But when an animal moves, it's leaving genetic material behind. And so through our work, we've been able to determine that a yearling male buck will travel approximately 11 miles for us. And that's pretty consistent with some other studies where they've done telemetry work, but we did it through genetics and through DNA. But it's like Marcelo was saying, is those bucks, if that yearling male is moving 11 miles, and then they were able to look at it by age, by sex, and then by CWD, and determining whether CWD animals have a larger home range or not. Do they just not interact as much with other individuals? I think it's just that risky action of a buck is what's causing him to have that more prevalence to him, where Marcelo was like talking about those females, which is, that's your mother's, daughters, nieces, aunts. They're typically all kin to each other, and they're going to be a pretty tight-knit group. Their home range is not near as large.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think it's just, it's all behavior and dispersal for a lot of those, for that factor. And I think the discussion of genetics in general is another big topic that's starting to come up a lot more within the agencies, talking about the variations in the PRNP gene. And, some research has shown that there's differences in susceptibility. And so I think, like, moving forward, some of the interesting questions there are, like, given that CWD has been in an area for a long amount of time, there's been this selective pressure on those genes for that time. So if we could start looking and monitoring over across time, they're like, are they becoming less susceptible to the disease? And are we kind of those pressures aligning that in there? I think is another big question that we would want to get to eventually. And we're trying to actually work on that now. We collected a lot of genetic samples, so we're trying to at least start pushing that conversation there, just to see what's going on from a natural perspective there.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. And just to clarify, though, not to be as susceptible does not mean to be immune.
Yes.
And there's no documentation of any deer being immune to CWD.
Neither fully, no partially, right?
Exactly.
And a lot of those studies showed that even though they were less susceptible, once they got it, they're still going to die just like everybody else. In some studies, it showed they might survive for a little bit longer, but and this I think was in transgenic mice too, so it's not even a necessarily 1-to-1 comparison for a deer.
And if you think about that susceptibility, a little bit more or less susceptible to it, still gets it, maybe lives a little longer, which means it's spreading that disease for longer. It is spreading those diseased prions for longer.
Yeah.
And then also you think about susceptibility, and we probably shouldn't even dive into this because we don't know a lot about it at this point, but what are they predisposed to? There's typically trade-offs. So maybe I'm less susceptible to CWD. Is there a trade-off? Is there something else that's going to take me out later? You know what I mean? We just don't know a lot in that realm. And I think it's really important, and glad to hear that y'all are looking into it.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest kind of concern when we start talking about selective breeding, right, for less susceptible individuals is the fact that we can't apply all these natural pressures during that selective breeding process, right? When we have nutrition, predation, we treat animals if they're sick. And so, like you said, we don't know what we're actually producing at the end of the day in terms of a naturally viable deer that's going to be out there. And so I'm much more in the camp of this is naturally occurring already, but in nature, there's those additional pressures of hunters, predation, right? Forage is bad. That's going to add to that and mold the genes there, that individual and of that population in the right way where we know it's going to be beneficial because they're going to be producing fawns right there.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that because that is I know that there are people that are like, well, we'll just, get captive facility and we'll do this and we'll push it. And again, you don't know what you're predisposing those animals to. And then also wildlife aren't livestock. You know what I mean? So, okay, you figure something out. What do you do then? So I think that what you said is very important. Like these animals are evolving under the pressures that they should be evolving under. And that means a lot.
Yeah. And it's hard to replicate all those things and get it exactly right. And not to say that we shouldn't keep pursuing this kind of genetic work and understanding it, but I think we need to just kind of understand that we're still kind of in the infancy stage and that we need a lot more information before we start making hardline decisions on those kinds of things, I think.
Yeah, it's good to know that there are other issues that could arise. It's like research. It looks good on paper, but you gotta consider all of the other things that could be a problem. And there are lots of other things that could be a problem.
Absolutely.
I think just to summarize everything that you two just said, right? It's important to have this research and know what's going on in a captive situation because that gives us so much more information that we can work with. But regardless of what we find in a captive situation, that doesn't mean we can just open the gates and let them out in the wild and have any impact on free-ranging native deer. Those two things don't jive. And our predecessors have done a lot of work in the past to show, even with just trying to manipulate antler size.
Yeah.
It takes a lot. Exactly. It takes a lot of work to manipulate free-range genetics, which is why we always talk about it as not being able to be manipulated. So same thing here, right? Good work to be done. But let's not put the cart in front of the horse.
Yeah, no, great example. And then also, if you think about those that tend to be less susceptible, could be a reason why we're not seeing that a lot. Why we're not, every third deer that we catch doesn't have that gene. There could be something, one of those negatives that's keeping that from being so abundant on the landscape. So anyways, I'm glad that there are people exploring all avenues. I mean, this is what we do, right? We're trying to figure out how to mitigate this issue. So it's important and taking all sorts of different directions. That's important too. All right. So earlier, we had talked about the younger bucks being more susceptible. And we had talked about them being more prone to moving and, traveling 11 miles, whatever it may be. And you all looked a little bit at movement or home range, things like that. Can you talk a little bit about that? Terrain, anything else you want to add?
Yeah. So I think one of the interesting things that we found here is that in the areas where we had the highest prevalence, right, Irby, where the deer and elk were first detected in CWD, we actually also saw greater home range overlap, at least with the deer under study. And that kind of just follows the idea of the theory behind that disease epidemiology of CWD that we would expect. If there's more overlap, there's more contact between them, that transmission would happen more easily. And so we would expect to see higher prevalence rates. And we similarly saw that across deer that were CWD positive compared to another CWD positive deer. They had higher home range overlap compared to those that were not detected. And so it's an interesting finding. I think the implications of it are a little bit too far for me to talk about in terms of what that means, but it does kind of lend some credence to what we'd expect to see out of this disease.
Yeah, that's interesting. Having an influence on how they navigate the landscape and the areas that they occupy, it's interesting. Well, Eric, you got any questions or anybody else?
I've got so many questions that I could talk to these two for a very long time, but I think for the sake of time, I can save those for later.
Yeah. Well, this has been, this is great. Glad to have you on, but we're not here to have a doom and gloom conversation, right? We're just laying out the facts of what y'all have found with this project. You're sharing that with us. And, and ultimately the goal is to take away some kind of understanding of what we could do to help mitigate this issue so that our kids and our grandkids and stuff aren't dealing with something that we'd rather not be dealing with. What kind of management implications would you say come out of this?
Yeah, so that's one of the things about the report that we've been talking about for some time. That last chapter, I fell in love with that last chapter because there's just so much goodness to it, because it gets all of the findings. And it's cool, right? I mean, we're all scientists and we all get really nerdy on talking about deer movements and all this other stuff. But how do we take that and actually put it to use? And they do that. Marcelo and the researchers at UGA took all of what they learned and put it down to I call it the dirt level for us, and say, okay, here's you some nuggets to go forth with. And like I said earlier, when we started this project in 2020, we froze time in that we have not changed any of the bag limits or season structure, anything in that deer zone. We manage deer by zones, and that's deer zone 2 is where this is located. And I want to give great thanks to our commissioners. We are, our agency was identified by Amendment 35 in our state, and our commissioners are governor appointed, and they are the ones that helped get this project off the ground. And they are the ones that have been fully committed to this project now for 5 years. And I think we just had a great group of commissioners during the tenure of this project. And so now we're actually going into a regulation cycle for 2026, and we're actually talking about things that we could need now to do, that we have information, and we're not running forward with blindly. But one of the things that came out of it, and we talked about it earlier, is that lambda number. And it's a number of scientists we know. 1.0 that's population stability. Ours is 0.86. So we're going negative, and that's a 14% decline annually in that population. So how do we get that number up? Well, they told us that in the report. They said, Game and Fish, you need to protect at least 20% of your females to get the number up to 1.0. So that's what we're going to do, is that we are working now. Our deer biologist, Ralph Meeker, he's coming up with a strategy in how do we protect at least 20% of our females? And that's really what we're going to start focusing on in that deer zone. Yeah, the bucks, we've talked about that, and the bucks are going to do what the bucks are going to do. But if we're going to try to have an impact on that population abundance and the population structure, we've got to put great effort on those females. And that's where we're going. We can monkey with that through bag limits and season structure, the number of days, and even the weapon at which you take these animals, because we know that some weapons are more efficient than others. But we're in the process right now of developing some proposals, and we will have those out for public comment in January. But I feel better going into this regulation cycle because I have now data to stand on. We have information that supports what we want to do, and it's not just walking out there blindly. So that's where we're going to look at. We're going to spend a lot of time on looking at bag limits and how we can manipulate those to get that 20% minimal increase in our females.
And the really nice part is, right, that's when we're talking about within that CWD zone. And so, but there's also management implications when we're talking about when we're outside of that CWD zone, when we don't have it. The beautiful part of it all is what we need to do is just more deer management. All the things we've talked about before, we were talking about doe management, having good habitat management. All these things are also good CWD management when we're outside of the zone. And so preparing and having good resilient populations outside of the zone is a part of, I think, that equation as well, not just in the areas where you do have or see CWD.
Yeah. And I think I'm glad that y'all covered that part of it too, because it's important. I feel like sometimes we don't do a good job of explaining to people hey, we're doing this research so that we can better understand a situation and make changes that are going to improve that situation, identify issues and how do we mitigate those issues. And y'all have, here you are, start to almost finish here with not only getting this information out to the public, but also, actually going to take this to legislation and say, hey, to better conserve and manage our deer population, here is what we have found to do through good science. That's important.
Science-based management. One thing I've always talked about is you cannot manage what you don't know. And how do you figure that stuff out? You conduct research, you get baseline information, and you know a little bit better what you need to do moving forward. And that's what you all have done here. It's excellent.
And it's a process, right? Like we go back and we're going to look, again, over and over. And sometimes we need to update that. And I think that's part of the thing where a lot of the hunters or public, might not understand fully in that scientific method is like, there's a constant updating and refreshing of the information that we do know. Like we based this study and did all this work based on all the previous work that had been done. And so we moved the needle a little bit further, and then someone else is going to take it and run with it as well. And so, sometimes things change, but that just means we're updating our information. We're getting better, more detailed information on this disease. Because like we talked about, a lot of these things are still in its infancy, right? In terms of our understanding.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Science is a systematic approach to laying the next stepping stone, right? And you pick that up like we've mentioned several times of the previous research that's been done. A lot of that up north. Now we've got a southeastern project that's been done, and we'll continue to build off of that. Yeah, it's a process.
We'll continue to collect harvest data. We're fortunate in that we have mandatory checking, and we've had mandatory checking for nearly 100 years now. I mean, we've been counting dead deer in Arkansas for a long time. And so we have a good historical database of harvest in that zone or in that county. And so we should be able to tell the difference then if we implement this change, how does that impact harvest? And then we collect biological data from our participants in our DMAC clubs. And then we'll monitor prevalence rate on the CWD. So we're going to have these checks and balances that we're going to be able to monitor management recommendations to see, are we making improvement or not? It's not like we're just going to throw out something and then walk away from it. We're going to tend to it every year to see, are we actually making some improvement, or do we need to readjust?
Yeah. Well, guys, is there anything else? We eventually got to go home to families and go to bed tonight. So is there anything else y'all'd like to mention? Or
now I want to give a shout out to our staff, that we have many local staff in this area, and they were so invested in this project, and I want to give them great credit for that. I'm in Monticello. I'm in Southeast Arkansas. It's a whole other world away where this project was taking place, but the local staff, our decision makers, our directorate, our commissioners, they were fantastic with our leadership of this project. And then just the researchers from UGA, utmost professionalism, and I just give them thanks for all the work that they've done for us. And then thank y'all for having us on. I've been a big fan of Deer University for a long time, and I listen to it every time y'all drop a new episode. And so thank y'all for taking the time and letting us have this platform, because that's where we're at right now. We're wanting to preach the gospel of this. We're wanting to get out and spread the word of what we've found, and hopefully other states can benefit from it. But our job's not done until we get the word out and communicate it. And I think this is a great platform to do it.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I want to echo those sentiments there, and also include the public there, the landowners and hunters of Northwest Arkansas. As much as I talk about the technicians and the AGFC staff who were wonderful, the public there were the kind of deciding factor. And that's how we got a lot of our data back to us. So without them, this also wouldn't have happened.
Well, thank y'all. I mean, y'all are doing us a favor here. Thank y'all for making time for us. I mean, I've learned a tremendous amount of information. I think this is going to be an absolute game changer of a project. So thank y'all. Thank everyone involved, your commissioners, your staff. I understand how big of an army it takes to do, large scale projects. And that's probably an understatement to what y'all did. It's truly going to be a game changer. So thank y'all very much for being here with us. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, we ain't got but about 2 weeks till deer season, at least in our neck of the woods. So, we'll be waiting on cooler weather and time to climb a tree. So thank y'all. Y'all have a good one.
We thank the Patrick F. Taylor Foundation and the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson family for their endowed financial support. We would not be able to do this without it. We're also grateful to our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service, and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center.
If you have questions or ideas, check out MSUDeerLab.com and hit the Deer University tab. Thanks for listening.